I'm going to talk about joint work that I did recently with Alberto Lesina and Francesco Trebbi. So this picture was taken at the time of the crisis. On the left, you see the German view of things on Greece. On the right, you see the Greek view of things on Germany. So this picture is not very pleasant, and it makes you wonder whether it is really feasible to think about European integration, particularly further European integration. As we all know, the euro was, first of all, a political project. So that's what we are going to discuss here. I think one way to think about this picture is that, of course, there is a lot of conflict and heterogeneity between different countries. But if you stop for a moment, you realize that there is also a large amount of heterogeneity within countries. And so what we're going to do is to try and compare the cultural heterogeneity as an indicator of preferences between and within countries to assess whether indeed this picture represents reality in a deep sense or whether it's mainly guided by stereotypes. And the approach that we take is the approach that economists, in particular Lesina and Spolaore, have pioneered, trying to think of political integration as involving a decision over a trade-off between, on the one hand, the benefits of economies of scale in providing public goods in a variety of areas like defense and foreign policy and public finance, versus the cost of heterogeneity of preferences. The more different we are, the more difficult it is to agree, and the more the minority will have to bear the cost of integration. But on the other hand, and so this calls for being small, on the other hand, the bigger we are, the more we can exploit the benefits of integration. Now, with regard to Europe, I think there is a large consensus, not among elites and policymakers, but among citizens at large, that the benefits of getting together in some key areas are very large. As you see, in 2016, in opinion polls, 80% of respondents would like more EU-level decision-making in fighting terrorism, in promoting peace and democracies, largely foreign policy and defense, in environmental control, immigration control, and energy. So there is no doubt in the minds of European citizens that the benefit of economies of scale is large. And so the question is really, are we too different as Europeans to exploit these benefits? And as I said, we focus mainly on deeply held cultural traits, on cultural heterogeneity, and we ask whether I think that's one component of trust that, of course, is needed. And then we ask whether the economic integration that we have seen in Europe has made the trade-off more or less favorable in the sense of reducing the pre-existing heterogeneity in our preferences. So this is what I will be talking about. First, I ask how different are Europeans in their deeply held cultural traits compared to the heterogeneity that we see within countries, and also compared to the heterogeneity that we observe in the US. Then we ask whether there's been cultural convergence or divergence, if we become more similar or more dissimilar. And then I will look at institutional convergence if I have time, because the functioning of institutions is also another important dimension in discussing political integration. And then I will conclude with some discussion. The sample of countries is the EU 15 plus Norway. I'm not sure why we included Norway. We could have included Switzerland, but I think that's how we started. And the sample is between 1980 and 2008. So two things are to note about this. First is that we end before the financial crisis, which probably changed some of these aspects. And second, we do not include the countries that may be a bit more different because they were more recent inflows in the European Union, namely Eastern and Central Europe. Now, to measure heterogeneity of cultural traits, we rely on 20 questions taken from the European value surveys. These are opinion polls that are asked to a representative sample of each country. There are 4 or 5 waves between 1980 and 2008. And we selected 5 dimensions of culture. The first dimension is religiosity, not religion, but religiosity, meaning how important is religion to you, and then some principles that would be relevant in most religions, like euthanasia and suicide. Second dimension is the gender role of women in society and in the family. Third is sexual morality, your views on abortion, homosexuality, divorce. Then, what is your views on the role of the state in society? What is the role of the state in redistribution? How much should we rely on individual responsibility versus risk sharing? How important is it to protect private property and more general indicators of political ideology? And then some deeply held opinions on values and civic capital that have been studied by economists and sociologists, namely generalized trust. What are the qualities that you appreciate in children, such as being obedient, being hardworking, being unselfish, and what is your view on the possibility that you have of having control over your life? Now, if you think about these questions, what is obvious is that they are not policy questions. Should we raise interest rates? Should we spend a bit more today or have a larger deficit? We think that these more policy questions are more volatile. They change, they are contingent, and these are more stable views of the world that would tell you what is the general view of the world and the role of the state that individuals have. And we think these are the important dimensions to study. Think about marriage. When you marry with someone, it's important to know the view of the world of your partner. This is a very incomplete contract. We're talking about a very important decision of political integration. And so we want to understand how deeply different we are in some stable features. The research by economists and sociologists has shown that these features change, but do not change so rapidly. Then on these 20 questions, I should say we were a bit constrained in the range of questions because we wanted to preserve comparability both across countries and over time, so this limited the number of questions that we had. And then we selected randomly 250 respondents. In fact, we also replicated the results with 500 respondents in each country and each wave. So these are the number of individuals. For the measures of heterogeneity that I will be talking about, we only focus at the latest wave, 2008, but for the convergence, we exploit the full sample. Now, think about an individual here as a vector. For the non-economists in the room, think of this as a point in a multidimensional space. And this point, so this is not very helpful, you're saying. Okay, so an individual gives you a response to 20 of these questions. Okay, so you have an individual is a response to 20 questions. And there are many of such individuals. And now we want to measure the distance between these individuals. So if there was only one question, it would be easy. You just measure the distance between these 2 points on the line. Here you need to measure the distance between these vectors, between these individuals who give you responses on 20 dimensions. And of course, there is a way to measure distance in this 20-dimensional space, which is just a straightforward extension of what you would do when you compare distance between 2 points on a line. I will show you results that refer to just raw distance. We call this unconditional distance between these points, these individuals, or conditional distance, which is which means that we measure distance after we have controlled for observable features of these individuals, whether they are male or females, how old they are, how educated they are, what is their occupation, whether they are employed or unemployed. So we measure the cultural distance in these responses between these individuals before and after having taken into account their demographic and economic situation. And this is a graph that I will be repeating, so it's worth spending a little bit of time understanding what it means. So let me just point out first that each of these responses has been normalized to lie between 0 and 1. So this picture on the horizontal axis is measured between 0 and 1 by construction. And it measures the distance, the cultural distance between individuals. So what this picture gives you is the distribution of bilateral distances. In the solid line is the distribution in bilateral distances between individuals who belong to different countries. Let's look on the left-hand side panel. And the dotted line is the distribution of bilateral distances between individuals that belong to the same country. What does this mean? So 0 are two individuals who have identical views. 1 are individuals who have the largest possible distance in their views. And in between, there is a whole possibility of cultural distances. And the height of the line tells you how many individuals differ by 0, by 0.2, by 0.4, by 0.6, 0.8, and so on. So remember, we had a large number of individuals, 250 times 16 countries. So we select all of these individuals in the sample, and for each pair, we compute how distant they are, and then we compute the frequency distribution of how many individuals differ by 0, by 2, and so on. And this is depicted in this picture. On the left-hand side is just what I told you. On the right-hand side is instead the same distribution of bilateral distances after you control for the demographic features of the individual. So you see that on average, these individuals differ by 0.6 out of 1. But what is striking about this picture is how close the dotted and the solid lines are. Namely, the distribution of distances between individuals that belong to the same country is almost the same as the distribution of distances, cultural distances, between individuals that belong to different countries. The difference is only about 5% of the average. So on average, individuals, the average distance between Europeans of different countries is only 5% higher than the average distance between two Europeans belonging to the same country. So yes, Greece and Germany are different, but so are many individuals within Germany, so are many individuals within Greece. This is what is striking here, that we exaggerate the differences in culture between countries because we tend to forget how large are the differences in culture within countries. Now, you may object to this by saying maybe this is all measurement error. What you're capturing here is that we don't measure cultural traits very well. There is a lot of measurement error, and this is just reflected in the distribution that you're portraying. I don't think this is right. The magnitude by which within-country heterogeneity swamps the between-country heterogeneity is just too large, and to believe that this is all driven by measurement error, you would need to think that the variability of measurement error is over 9 times the observed variability between countries, which essentially would mean that these survey data are meaningless, and I don't think that's right. They have been shown to correlate with behavior in very significant ways. And just to further convince you of this, this is the same picture illustrating the differences within Europe to differences between Europe and Turkey. Turkey is, of course, more different than from a standard European country than the European sample that I described. And you see here that the distribution of distances is significantly further apart. So these surveys do capture something that does differ between countries that a priori we think are different. But in the case of European countries, it's not. It's telling you that the within-country heterogeneity is much larger than the between-country heterogeneity. Then we ask, what explains cultural distance between individuals? And here are 2 answers that are suggested by the data. The first is, of course, socioeconomic distance. So 2 individuals that differ by income or age or education tend to be culturally more different compared to individuals that are similar. And also geographic distance is correlated with cultural distance. This is plausible, but again, if you look at the numbers, maybe you cannot see them. The intercept, the vertical position of these lines, the solid line is between country, the dotted is within. What I'm saying is that the height of the line, the intercept, is 10 orders of magnitude larger than the slope. So what this means is that both socioeconomic distance and geographic distance do not explain much of the heterogeneity that we observe. It's difficult to explain this heterogeneity. It's correlated with observable features of the individual, but to many degrees it is left unexplained. Second, we ask, where is the cultural center of Europe? So remember, we have all these individuals, these points in this 20-dimensional space. So we can compute the average of this space, the centroid, which is essentially the average of these individual positions in this 20-dimensional space. And then we can compute how distant is each respondent from the cultural center of Europe, from the prototypical cultural trait of Europeans. And because we know the region of residence of each respondent, we can also compute the cultural distance of each European region from the cultural center of Europe. And this is displayed here. The striped line are missing, so Switzerland is missing, unfortunately, as you know. Lighter color, other than those with lines, means that you are closer to this prototypical European. Darker color means that you are further away from the prototypical European in terms of cultural distance. So what this is telling you is that the cultural center of Europe is Germany. So Germany is the core, the economic core, but also happens to be the cultural core of Europe. Not because it's larger, so here each country has the same number of respondents. So if you were to weight this by population, it would be strengthened further. But without weighting for population, Germany is closer to the prototypical European. The second message that this tells you is that, however, the economic periphery, such as, for instance, Greece and Portugal, is not also the cultural periphery. You see that Spain is more similar in these attitudes to the center than many regions of France or Northern Europe. So this is good, because if cultural distance corresponded to economic distance, then perhaps integration would be more difficult. Instead, this is not the case. You also see that France is somewhat peculiar in its cultural trait. Maybe we knew this. Germany is also, sorry, not Germany, England is also somewhat distant. And you see that there is also a lot of regional heterogeneity within countries. So this too points to the importance of heterogeneity within countries. There are different colors within different countries. Then we ask the following question. In these survey questions, they ask you how afraid you are of more integration in a number of dimensions, in fiscal policy, in immigration policy, in regulation, in environmental policy. We take the average of these fears of integration in these 5 or 6 policy dimensions, and we combine that in an index which we call fear of European integration. So this is an index of how reluctant you are to see more European integration in specific policies. And we try to explain this, so this is based on individual responses. We try to explain this based on the observable features of the individual and on the cultural distance of this respondent from the center of Europe. And that's the cultural distance variable that you see in this table. And what this table tells you is that, as you would expect, if you are culturally more distant from the center of Europe as an individual, then you are also more afraid of further European integration. And this is true also within countries and within regions, when you control for the country and region fixed effects, which means that even in individuals within the same region tend to be more afraid of Europe if they are culturally more distant from Europe. So this suggests that our cultural measure is capturing something. However, when you look at the specific numbers, again, the message is that cultural distance is correlated with fear of integration, but its effect is quantitatively small. To give you a sense, suppose that we reduced the cultural distance from its average to the minimum value in the sample, how much more willing would the respondent be to integrate? And the answer is only by 6% of the average fear of integration that we have. So the effect is statistically important, but quantitatively, cultural distance is not the dominant force when it comes to being afraid of European integration. And this in a sense is in line with the message that I want to convey, namely that heterogeneity of cultural traits is not the stumbling block that is preventing further political integration in Europe. So the long answer that I gave to the first question is how much heterogeneity there is between countries compared to within countries, and the answer is not much. Second benchmark is let's compare Europe to the US. Are we much more different as Europeans than residents of different US states? So we took a subset of these questions, only 15, not 20, that were asked over time in the GSS survey, a similar survey that is run in the US. Unfortunately, this survey is not very large, so we could not take all states because we would have too few respondents. We had to aggregate states together. So we either took the 9 largest states with at least 60 respondents per state, or we aggregated states in 5 macro regions. The results are very similar. This is what the data tell you about the heterogeneity that we observe in the US. So the left-hand side is, again, the raw numbers, how distant are individuals. It portrays the distribution of bilateral distances. The right-hand side panel is the same picture after you have controlled for the demographic characteristics of the individual. The first row gives you the distribution of bilateral distances comparing individuals in the US within state and between states. You only see one line because they are superimposed on each other. So the distribution in the US, the distribution of bilateral distances within state is identical to the distribution of bilateral distances within states. So this would suggest maybe the US is a bit more inclined to stick together because these two distributions are identical. It's actually not like this because if you compare the US to Europe, this is done in the remaining 2 rows, the data tell you is that the US differ from Europe in that they have more heterogeneity within states, but they have the same amount of heterogeneity between states. So the second row compares the distributions of distances in Europe and in the US for individuals belonging to the same state in Europe or in the US. And the solid line is the US. The dotted line is Europe. So you see it's shifted to the right, meaning there is a little bit more distance within states in Europe, in the US compared to Europe. The third row repeats the same exercise, the distribution of bilateral distances in Europe and in the US for individuals belonging to different states. And you see that the two distributions are very similar. So what this tells you is that the between states distribution in the US and Europe is essentially the same. Okay? We have the same degree of heterogeneity. So the US, of course, are a successful democracy. They've been such for a long time. If they succeed with this level of heterogeneity, why shouldn't Europe do so? Not because we are so different. Before returning to this question, let me then devote a little bit of time to the overtime comparison. So have we become more or less similar over time? Of course, in the last decades, remember we compare 1980 to 2008, Europe has integrated economically in many ways through more trade, through more mobility of people, through financial integration by having the euro. And we know that some of this integration has been accompanied by economic convergence and increased correlation in output and more similar policy challenges. So what does this economic integration imply about cultural convergence? Well, on the one hand, we would expect that by integrating economically, being in more frequent contact with each other, we have become more similar. So we should expect more cultural convergence. On the other hand, you may argue that integration has also led to more specialization. As you trade, you specialize, and if you specialize, maybe this makes you more different. So a priori, we don't know how this may have changed. And this is the answer. So again, the left-hand side is the raw distribution of distance. The right-hand side is after you control for observables. The solid line is individuals belonging to the same country. Let me take that back. So the first row is the distribution of distances for individuals belonging to different countries, and the bottom row is the distribution for individuals in the same country. And now the comparison of the two distributions is such that the solid line is 2008, and the dotted line is 1980, the beginning of the period. So what this is telling you is that no matter how you distribute, you measure it, we have become more dissimilar over time. The distribution has shifted to the right, both between countries and within countries. So there has been cultural divergence over time. The fact that this has happened both between and within suggests that probably this is not due to economic integration in Europe. It's something that may have to do with technological progress or with other forces that may be at work. We also looked at the evolution of these traits over time, one by one. So we looked at each of the 5 dimensions that I mentioned to you, the role of the state, the gender role, sexuality, and so on. This is, so the first answer is that in almost all dimensions, there has been cultural divergence. This is an example of what has happened on the trait corresponding to gender norms, gender equality. The solid line here is the European average, and the dotted line is the average in each of the countries. So the upper left is Austria, then Belgium, and so on. So if you look at this with a bit more time than I will allow you, what you will see is that all of Europe has become more modern. Higher value means that the gender roles have become more modern. But Northern European have done so typically faster than Southern European. So the gap between Northern and Southern Europe has increased a bit, although Italy and Spain and Portugal have become more modern too. They have done so at a slower pace than Northern European. And this is true of other cultural traits as well. So the divergence that we see between countries is due to the fact that the more modern part of Europe has become even more modern at a more rapid pace than the more backward part of Europe. And we suspect that the same is happening within countries. Then we ask the same question about the US. Has there been cultural convergence or divergence in the US? So it's the same picture as before. The right is after you control for the individual characteristics. The left is the raw data. The upper picture gives you the distribution of distance for individuals that belong to different US states. The bottom row belong to the same state. The solid line is the distribution at the end of the sample, 2008. The dotted line at the beginning. And here too, you see that the distribution at the end of the sample is shifted to the right. So here too, there has been cultural divergence over time. And this result has been replicated recently by other studies. So one other lesson that you can draw from the data is that both in Europe and in the US, cultural heterogeneity has increased, So this again suggests that it has nothing to do with European integration. It's something that reflects perhaps the media or other events. Remember, we're talking about small numbers here, so by 5 or 10% more different. Other studies have found no trend, but certainly we can conclude that we have not become more similar despite the improved media technology. Okay, so that's the answer to the second question. Has there been convergence? No. How much time do I have left?
You have another 10 minutes.
Okay, so let me talk briefly about institutional convergence, and then I will try to discuss this more generally. I think institutional convergence is an important dimension of the question we are asking. Is Europe ready for more integration? Because one fear that you may have is that if there is a big gap in the functioning of institutions between Northern and Southern Europe, maybe the implementation of common policies will be difficult. So what we ask here is, did economic integration and the deliberate efforts at harmonization that Europe has undertaken, did they result in convergence in the effectiveness of institutions in a variety of domains? And again, the answer is a priori uncertain. On the one hand, you expect that integration and harmonization of policies, such as through the Lisbon process, led to more convergence. On the other hand, perhaps the process of specialization that is associated with trade may have led in the opposite direction. So we look at 4 indicators of the functioning of institutions. The first one is the quality of governance as observed from perception measures. So these are largely survey measures, but also some hard measures. Second, the quality in particular of legal institutions, which again is based on perceptions, but also hard indicators of how the judicial system is structured and works. Regulatory policy and educational outcomes measured by PISA scores. These are scores, standardized questions that are asked in a number of schools in each country that give you comparable measures of the educational achievements of students in different positions in the school. And this is one way to look at these data. This is portraying, so the horizontal axis here is time from 1980 to 2008, and the vertical axis gives you the variability of these indicators across countries. So the lower the vertical number, the more similar you are, the higher, the more variance there is between countries. And so what we are interested in is in the pattern over time. And as you see, with regard to the top 2, namely the quality of government and the quality of legal institutions, the variance across countries has increased from the year 2000 onwards. So we have become more dissimilar in the functioning of our institutions. When it comes to regulation, the bottom right-hand side, we have become more similar. This is not surprising because, of course, we have deliberately, these are product market regulation, and it is not surprising because there's been an effort to harmonize product market regulation. The good news is the bottom left, which tells you that there has been convergence, so more similarity over time in the PISA scores. The educational outcomes have improved. And largely, this, I think, is because Northern Europe has done a bit worse. It was very good early on, and it has deteriorated a bit relative to the rest of Europe. When you look at the first 2 indicators, the quality of legal institutions and the quality of government, again, this is the same kind of picture I illustrated before. For each country, the solid line is the country and the dotted line is the European average. And this is telling you that divergence in the functioning of institutions has occurred because the North has improved its institutions while functioning of institutions, while the South, on average, has led to a deterioration in the quality of, perceived quality of its institution, in some cases even actual quality. So here the message is not very optimistic. Despite the deliberate efforts at harmonization, institutions have become more dissimilar in their outcomes, except for product market and educational outcomes. So let me then try to discuss what to make of these findings. So I started by telling you economists see the question of optimal political integration as entailing a trade-off between economies of scale on the one hand, on the benefit side, and heterogeneity of preferences on the cost side. By this metric, Europe is ready for integration in the sense that there is not a large amount of heterogeneity compared to the reasonable benchmarks within countries and the US. I'm not saying that this means that Europe should move on with political integration. I'm saying that if there is something that is preventing political integration in Europe, it is not deeply held cultural heterogeneity. It is something else, and I think the something else is what we are seeing in many political fora recently, namely the strength of national identities. And unfortunately, this has become worse, or maybe fortunately, depending on your point of view, but certainly it has become worse over time. So there is a question that has been repeatedly asked in this period about how proud you are of your national identity. And as you see, on average, and in most of these countries, Europeans have become more proud of their national identities over time by a significant amount. And if you think about this a bit more, national identities may be good in the sense that they give rise to national cohesion and feelings of affiliation with your country, but they often are also based on stereotypical images and beliefs of the differences between your nationality and other nationalities. A feature of nationalism is often that it exaggerates the similarity of individuals within countries, and it exacerbates and exaggerates the perceived differences between countries. So to the extent that nationalism is associated with the stereotyping, maybe a consequence is that it makes it more difficult to integrate, also because it exaggerates differences. And of course, it may bring about mistrust, as in the initial slide between Greece and Turkey. So I think the main lesson that we have learned in writing this paper is that the stumbling block that prevents political integration in Europe and the exploitation of these benefits from economies of scale is not that we Europeans are different, but it's the strength and the importance of national identities. We somehow are more inclined to accept compromise with our citizens. We are much less willing to accept compromise with citizens of other countries. Not all hope is lost for political integration, because if you look at another question that is asked in these opinion polls on European identity, how important is your European identity? Over time, the answer to these questions has fluctuated, but has not changed in significant way. So despite the rise of nationalism, at least until, well, actually even until 2016, despite the rise of nationalism, the sense of European identity has not weakened, it has remained roughly constant. So the last question that I would like to very briefly mention is how can we strengthen, if we think that Europe would benefit for more integration politically because of the important economies of scale and scope in public good provision in a world that is becoming bigger and bigger, how can we strengthen the sense of European identity to make it politically acceptable to integrate more? And I think there are 3 points that to me are important. The first point is education. So if you think about the history of unification of current member states, of current nations, a couple of centuries ago, these states were very divided too. They even had different languages. And the state devoted a very substantial effort to education with the goal of bringing together citizens into generating a common identity. The public education system, to a large degree, also had this purpose. So I think in Europe we should think more carefully about this as a tool for strengthening the sense of European identity, not only expanding student exchange, but also thinking about the curriculum in a way that would emphasize the knowledge of European institutions and the knowledge of European history. The second aspect is how integration is achieved is also very important to strengthen or weaken European identification. And here I think the important distinction is between intergovernmental decision-making versus building European institutions that are accountable to citizens directly, such as through the European Parliament or with the European Commission or with the European Central Bank. The difference between building European institutions and intergovernmental bargaining, of course, is that when you engage in intergovernmental bargaining, the government is accountable to its own citizens for the trophies that it brings home, for having obtained a good bargain in a game that is often perceived as a zero-sum game. And so this obviously would strengthen this intergovernmental approach, tend to strengthen the national identification, whereas a different method of integration would have the opposite effect. And finally, I think a logical implication is that there may be benefits to proceeding with different speeds because so far it's not obvious that all countries are equally similar in a number of dimensions. And so maybe it is time to think about different speeds of integration in different areas for different subsets of countries. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.